The Electronic Criminal by M.A. Holland. Table of Contents. Chapter 1, Probable Cause. Chapter 2, Position of Trust. Chapter 3, Facts about Mr. Johnson's Scheme. Chapter 4, The Witnesses. Chapter 5, The Video Store's Indictment of Mr. Johnson. Chapter 6, Layout of the Video Store. Chapter 7, How Mr. Johnson Developed His Scheme. Chapter 8, Explanation of Mr. Johnson's Confession. Chapter 9, Final Thoughts. Chapter 1, Probable Cause. The following account is of a crime that was perpetrated in a video store where my husband Frank worked. I am going to give you a little background here. Back in January of 1996, Frank was drowning in credit card debt. He had been getting one credit card to pay another. This was going on for about 8 years. I asked Frank on several occasions, "How is our financial situation?" And he said, "Marie, don't worry. We are doing great, and we are breaking even with the bills, and we have plenty of available credit." I didn't have a clue of what was going to happen next. Then, in September of 1996, the United States Postal Service broke into our home with guns drawn and seized evidence which was used to railroad Frank to prison for credit card fraud and mail fraud. He was sentenced to 12 to 14 months. Before he self-surrendered, he hired people to cover for him while he was paying his debt to society. He hired this guy that he knew for a while and was a steady customer in the video store, and his friend. Since this guy's name was Johnson, I will use it here for this story because it is a common name. Frank confided in him and let Mr. Johnson know about his pending incarceration. You guessed it, Mr. Johnson went from being Frank's Huckleberry friend to becoming the electronic criminal, is what this story is all about. After Mr. Johnson perpetrated his crime at the video store, Frank was serving his time at the prison camp. Some of the information used in this expose was compiled by Frank while he was at the prison camp to clear his name of any wrongdoing against the video store and making sure that Mr. Johnson doesn't get away scot-free, leaving the video store holding the bag. All the funds that Mr. Johnson stole from the video store was going to have to be paid back by this small business, or it will have to close down. This is what went down. Frank was researching his case and Mr. Johnson's scheme at the law library to provide the video store with information to give the banks involved, to convict Mr. Johnson, and to get the video store off the hook. Next, Frank kept sending me reports of this ongoing investigation of Mr. Johnson and his scheme. I kept giving these reports to the owner of the video store as fast as Frank sent them to me. I was keeping copies of these reports in a box with all our papers pertinent to Frank's case. Since this story happened over 20 years ago, I am going to interpret what happened using the reports that Frank sent me to tell the story of how Mr. Johnson became an electronic criminal. The following account is of a crime that was perpetrated in a video store by Frank's Huckleberry friend, using the store's point-of-sale terminal. This friend of Frank name was Mr. Johnson, and he embezzled thousands of dollars over several months in 1997. To 3 banks were involved in this swindle. The amount that Mr. Johnson ended up getting was $46,000. The scheme was discovered by my husband Frank. The following ongoing investigation should prove probable cause. I believe that 3 laws were broken in the commission of this embezzlement of funds from the video store by Mr. Johnson. They are as follows. Law 1, wire fraud, because the video store's access device was connected to the telephone line. Law 2, credit card fraud, because Mr. Johnson used credit cards to perpetrate his crime. And Law 3, conspiracy, because at least one other person was involved. There could be other charges, but I think that's enough for now. Mr. Johnson used the video store's access device to embezzle money for his own personal use. He achieved this by transferring money from someone else's credit card to his Mac Visa account. Mr. Johnson was doing this for months. The video store was not aware of his scheme. Remember, what I'm discussing happened before Frank went to the prison camp. This fraudulent activity was going on undetected by this small business. Frank confided in Mr. Johnson because he promised to help me while Frank was away, and to cover his shifts and drive him to the prison camp to self-surrender. Frank didn't have a clue to what Mr. Johnson was doing, and when he finally took all the money that he intended to take, he told Frank that he took $46,000, which was in various denominations, and that he used the store's access device to do this. Frank couldn't believe what he told him. When Frank went home, he started thinking, what's going to happen while I'm in prison? If this guy is going to use me as a scapegoat. Frank was in enough trouble and owed enough money on his own and didn't need to be framed by Mr. Johnson, who was scheduled to open the video store the next day. Frank wasn't due until 2 p.m. When Frank arrived, he made sure that he had a blank videotape in the camcorder, just in case Mr. Johnson said or did anything before Mr. Johnson was ready to leave. Frank asked him, did you really get $46,000 from the store's access device? Frank then backed up, luring Mr. Johnson closer to the camcorder, and this is what he told Frank. I got 46 G's. And then in a bragging fashion, he said $46,000. Then he explained how he did it. Mr. Johnson told Frank that he took different amounts, which made up the $46,000. Frank asked him, why didn't you get more? Mr. Johnson told Frank that he didn't want to get in too deep in case he got caught. He also explained how he withdrew $10,000 in cash at one time, and if he would have taken more, the bank would have had to fill out a report. Mr. Johnson left the video store. Boy, was Frank glad that he had the camcorder on record. Frank couldn't wait to view the videotape. It came out very clear, and Frank was relieved. In case Mr. Johnson tried to involve Frank, he had his confession on tape. The next day, which was Sunday, Frank opened the store, and Mr. Johnson came in at 2 p.m. He showed Frank a 4-page bank statement showing all the transactions that he made. Mr. Johnson didn't say a word the rest of the shift. Frank and Mr. Johnson closed the store and left together. Mr. Johnson left the 4-page bank statement in the video store. Frank retrieved this 4-page bank statement and brought it home and put it in the box with all the other papers pertinent to Frank's case. Frank told his boss about the videotaped confession of Mr. Johnson and the 4-page bank statement. She told Frank that the merchant bank contacted her about the large transactions, and they were all made on Frank's days off. The merchant bank also told his boss that the video store was going to have to pay the money back unless they could prove that Mr. Johnson was the perpetrator. Frank called his lawyer and told him about the situation at the video store. He told Frank that as long as he has that videotape confession, he's protected from Mr. Johnson from trying to involve him later. Chapter 2, Position of Trust. The following evaluation of Mr. Johnson will demonstrate how he developed his embezzlement scheme against a video store, where he was employed for almost a year. He was given keys, computer passwords, and the alarm code. Mr. Johnson could go to the video store anytime he wanted, even after closing. He betrayed this position of trust that the video store placed upon him by using the store's access device to perpetrate his scheme. An abuse of trust is not necessarily an element of every embezzlement. The video store feels that Mr. Johnson took advantage of the position of trust that the video store placed in him by starting with small transactions first, and then when this wasn't detected by the bank or video store, he kept doing more transactions. Mr. Johnson abused his position of trust in a way that substantially facilitated the commission or concealment of the crime. Other employees, if they desired, could not embark upon a reasonably similar scheme of embezzling money because they were not in a position of trust. Since Mr. Johnson was a supervisor and had the authority to use the store's access device to make transactions and do settlement without the approval of other employees, proves that he betrayed his position of trust that was bestowed on him by the video store. Mr. Johnson embezzled thousands of dollars by using the video store's access device along with someone else's credit card to transfer money to his Mac Visa account. During the course of this investigation of Mr. Johnson, the video store found out that he was punching in the credit card numbers instead of using the actual card. Nothing suggests that the loss having to do with unauthorized charges made by punching in the numbers should be treated different from unauthorized charges made with the plastic itself. Legislative history also suggests that credit card number fraud should be treated the same as credit card fraud. Mr. Johnson's position of trust did give him the ability to commit a difficult-to-detect wrong because he was under no supervision when he opened or closed the video store. According to a reliable source, Mr. Johnson's mother was letting him use her Visa credit card, and he would pay her back for whatever he used. His mother's credit limit was $10,000, and this was when Mr. Johnson started using her card to make fraudulent sales on the video store's point-of-sale terminal. He accomplished this by making a sale of $200 and returning the $200 to his Mac Visa account. To keep the video store from detecting these bogus sales, he settled the point-of-sale terminal to zero. I would like to emphasize here that Mr. Johnson did not have his mother's actual plastic card. He just punched in the numbers. I'm not sure whether he had his mother's permission or not to do this. The video store believes that Mr. Johnson got permission from his mother in the beginning, but when he used up her credit limit, he acted on his own. The reason that Mr. Johnson's scheme was going undetected was because he made sure he settled the point-of-sale terminal after every transaction. At this point of the story, Mr. Johnson still kept using his mother's credit card by punching in the numbers and forcing the sales through. This was when Mr. Johnson first used the force sale button of the point-of-sale terminal. However, Mr. Johnson didn't call to get the approval number. He made up a 6-digit number and any amount, and the same sale went through. Now Mr. Johnson was back in business. Even though his mother's Visa credit card had no more credit left, he still was transferring bogus sales to his Mac Visa account. Mr. Johnson didn't care if the video store was going to owe all the money that he charged to his mother's credit card account that was over her limit. I think the turning point of the story is when Mr. Johnson was given classified information about Frank's case with the government. This was when Mr. Johnson accelerated his scheme. He got as much money as he could. This caused the merchant bank to notify the video store about the large sales. When Mr. Johnson was confronted by the owner of the video store, he said that he used the point of sale terminal to transfer money from one account to another and not to worry because he had all the receipts and he would make sure everything went through. The owner told Mr. Johnson that he can't work there unless he showed the receipts and settlement to her. Then Mr. Johnson told her he would bring everything in later that day. He never did. The video store owner called the bank the next day and told them about her confrontation with Mr. Johnson. The bank told the owner that the fraudulent charges to Mr. Johnson's mother's Visa account were over her limit and would be charged back to the video store merchant bank. Mr. Johnson got the money, and now the bank was saying that the video store owed the money and that the video store would have to prove they didn't. Chapter 3. Facts about Mr. Johnson's scheme. The following facts were given to the video store's merchant bank to help them with their investigation of Mr. Johnson and help them absolve the video store of any wrongdoing. The following 20 facts are true and verifiable. They are as follows. Fact number 1. Since Mr. Johnson worked at the flower shop and his bank was also in this complex, which was only a half a block from the video store, gave him credibility when he was hired by the video store. Fact number 2. Mr. Johnson knew everybody that worked in the complex where he worked, and that included his bank. From time to time, he would give the bank employees free flowers, free memberships, and free movies at the video store. Fact number 3. There is at least 1 or 2 employees at the bank who were involved in Mr. Johnson's scheme. He found out about the $10,000 rule from one of these bank employees, who told him that as long as he doesn't withdraw any more than $10,000, they won't have to fill out a currency transaction report. Fact number 4. One day in the video store, Mr. Johnson was overheard saying to one of his friends, "That's not what you know, it's who you know that counts." The video store has determined that Mr. Johnson was saying indirectly that someone at the bank helped him perpetrate his scheme. This comment was made right after he made a $10,000 cash withdrawal. Fact number 5. Mr. Johnson tried to get another person to be his partner in his scheme. This person refused and will testify against him if needed. This person was also Frank's friend, and this is the guy who helped me when Frank was serving his sentence at the prison camp. Fact number 6. Mr. Johnson destroyed evidence by having someone at his bank close his Mac Visa account. The video store has an audio tape of Mr. Johnson saying that he took out the rest of the embezzled money and had his bank account closed. Fact number 7. Mr. Johnson opened at least 2 checking accounts near his mother's home with the money that he embezzled from the video store. These accounts will probably tie in closely with the withdrawals that he made from his Mac Visa account. Fact number 8. Mr. Johnson also gave cash to his mother to hold for him in case he ever needed it. This could have been her share of the embezzlement scheme perpetrated by her son. Fact number 9. Remember, Mr. Johnson lived at home with his mother and didn't need much money to live on. Fact number 10. Mr. Johnson got engaged at the same time that he started working at the video store. Now he needed to make more money to pay mortgage payments on his new home that he was buying in the suburbs. Fact number 11. Mr. Johnson bragged about his mother letting him use her credit card and that he would pay her back. This didn't seem unusual, a mother letting her son use her credit card, but there was something that didn't make sense. They both have different last names, and he didn't use the plastic card when he made the fraudulent transactions. He was seen in the video store by customers punching in numbers on the point-of-sale terminal. This customer asked Mr. Johnson what he was doing. He said that he was programming the access device. Fact number 12. There seems to be a conspiracy brewing here. You have the mastermind, Mr. Johnson, his mother, and at least one employee from his bank helping him with the scheme. Fact number 13. Mr. Johnson forced the sales through on his mother's Visa account even though she didn't have enough available credit, resulting in the video store getting chargebacks for the bogus transactions. Fact number 14. Mr. Johnson kept forcing the sales through on his mother's Visa credit card account, and it didn't matter how much over the limit her card was. Fact number 15. Since the video store didn't know what Mr. Johnson was doing, it made it more difficult for the video store and the banks involved to detect. For example, 10 small amounts of $20 or less were normal sales for a small business, like the video store. Fact number 16. The fruition of the embezzlement scheme occurred when Mr. Johnson received classified information about Frank's pending incarceration. It was right after this that Mr. Johnson forced through amounts from $1,000 to $8,000, which is verified by the banks. Fact number 17. After Mr. Johnson transferred all the money that he intended to get from the video store's merchant account to his Mac Visa account, he withdrew the fraudulent funds via teller and Mac withdrawals, and also by personal checks. After Mr. Johnson did this, he boasted to Frank that he took $46,000 and described how he did this. He said that he didn't take this amount all at once, but he did take big amounts close together. Frank didn't believe him. The next day, he was still boasting to Frank about what he had done, but this time, Frank got his confession on videotape to further prove that Frank wasn't involved in Mr. Johnson's embezzlement scheme. Fact number 18. Mr. Johnson had easy access to the video store's point-of-sale terminal because he had keys and could come and go at will. During the video store's investigation, they noticed that some of the fraudulent transactions made by Mr. Johnson were on his days off. Fact number 19. Mr. Johnson could cause a very nice little business to go out of business because of the scheme that he perpetrated. The video store, any small business, couldn't survive if they had to pay the bank back for the money that Mr. Johnson stole. The video store worked on a small profit margin and had the experience to continue to be competitive. Fact number 20. Mr. Johnson needs to be stopped because as soon as the money runs out, he will probably strike again. When he was fired from the video store, he told one of his friends that he was looking for a job in one of the department stores downtown. Just think, if Mr. Johnson could get away with a scheme in a small business, just think of what he could do working for a big company. Chapter 4. The Witnesses. The following 12 witnesses were made aware of Mr. Johnson's scheme during the video store's investigation. Since I am writing this expose, you could call me witness number 13. I don't mention the names of the witnesses. Witness number 1 was the owner of the video store where Mr. Johnson was employed for almost a year and where he perpetrated his scheme. He worked very closely with the banks and Frank and had access to the personal information of all the witnesses, as well as the evidence. Witness number 2 was Frank, who worked very closely with the owner of the video store in the investigation of wrongdoing by Mr. Johnson. Frank also worked with Mr. Johnson and was also his friend. Their friendship ended when Frank found out about his scheme. Frank has spent a lot of time compiling as much information and evidence as he could to prove that Mr. Johnson embezzled the money from the video store for his own personal gain. Remember, it's not Frank's word against Mr. Johnson, it's the videotape confession that Frank has against Mr. Johnson that is going to count. Frank made a mistake years ago and doesn't want to get blamed for the embezzlement scheme that Mr. Johnson perpetrated. At this point of the story, Frank is paying his debt to society, which is his personal debt. The video store was not involved. Right now, Frank has two goals in life. First, to clear his name, and second, to make sure that Mr. Johnson has to be punished for his wrongdoing. The owner of the video store told me that she really appreciated all Frank's hard work on the video store's investigation of Mr. Johnson, and she will have his job waiting for him when he returns home. Witness number 3 was a very close friend of Mr. Johnson. They both worked at the same private club, and Mr. Johnson gave him a free membership and free rentals at the video store. Witness number 4 worked in a jewelry store on Jewelers Row and was also a good friend of Mr. Johnson, who sold him an expensive engagement ring. Mr. Johnson also gave this guy a free membership and free rentals at the video store. Witness number 5 has been friends with Mr. Johnson for about 10 years. When Mr. Johnson, for example, needed a car, he got it from this guy. Mr. Johnson was seen with this guy a lot. The video store thinks that witness number 5 could have been involved in Mr. Johnson's scheme. You guessed it. He gave this guy a free membership and free rentals at the video store. Witness number 6 was the owner of the flower shop where Mr. Johnson worked for 6 years. This flower shop was located a half a block from the video store. Mr. Johnson's scheme wouldn't have worked in the flower shop because they didn't accept credit cards and therefore didn't have an access device. Mr. Johnson gave witness number 6 a free membership and free rentals at the video store. Witness number 7 was Mr. Johnson's fiancée. They have been dating for about 2 years. Mr. Johnson bought her an expensive engagement ring from witness number 4 and gave her a free membership and free rentals at the video store. Witness number 8 was an employee at the video store and was very friendly with Mr. Johnson in and out of the video store. They used to go to clubs after work. Witness number 8 got a better paying job and she deleted her membership before she moved on. The owner of the video store has this witness's address and phone number on file in case her testimony is needed later. Witness number 9 is Frank's lawyer and was contacted as soon as Frank discovered Mr. Johnson's scheme and is holding some evidence for safekeeping and doesn't have a membership in the video store. He would be a credible witness if needed. Witness number 10 became very good friends with Mr. Johnson. They went shopping, they played pool, they partied at local clubs, and they drove around together just for the fun of it. Mr. Johnson tried to get this guy to be a partner in his embezzlement scheme. He refused. This witness must know all about Mr. Johnson's scheme. If he refused to be part of it, the video store feels that this guy would be a very good witness if needed. Witness number 10 was also Frank's best friend for 10 years and is the guy that helped me when Frank went to the prison camp. Witness number 11 was Mr. Johnson's mother and a possible co-conspirator in her son's scheme against the video store. When she was contacted by the banks and the video store, she gave conflicting stories. Witness number 12 was a bank employee who helped Mr. Johnson perpetrate his scheme and was probably the teller at the bank and could be a co-conspirator if this individual told Mr. Johnson about the $10,000 rule. Since this witness' name is unknown, the video store would have to do research on the bank's tellers. Witness number 13, yes, it's me, the author of this expose. Chapter 5, The Video Store's Indictment of Mr. Johnson. The following is the video store's version of how the government should indict Mr. Johnson for the federal laws that he violated. The video store believes that it was possible that Mr. Johnson could be indicted for at least 6 violations of federal law, which are the following. Violation number 1. Credit card fraud. Mr. Johnson knowingly used a credit card to obtain $1,000 or more within the 1-year period that he was employed by the video store. He used the video store's point-of-sale terminal to accomplish his scheme. For this violation of federal law, Mr. Johnson could be fined no more than $10,000 or imprisoned not more than 10 years or both. Violation number 2, conspiracy. Mr. Johnson, with the help of 1 or more persons, embezzled funds from the video store where he was employed. For violation of this offense, Mr. Johnson could be fined and imprisoned for no more than 5 years or both. The video store felt that without the help of at least 1 person, Mr. Johnson wouldn't have been able to keep his scheme from being detected for as long as he did. Violation number 3, access device fraud. Mr. Johnson knowingly and with the intent to defraud used the video store's point-of-sale terminal within the 1-year period that he was employed by the video store to fraudulently obtain at least $1,000 or more for his personal use. According to Mr. Johnson's videotape confession, he embezzled $46,000. He could be fined or pay twice the value obtained by the offense, whichever is greater, or imprisoned for not more than 15 years or both. Violation number 4. Mail fraud. Mr. Johnson devised a scheme to obtain money by using the video store's point-of-sale terminal. In doing so, he inadvertently used the mails because the video store's bank, the credit card bank, and Mr. Johnson's bank all used the mail to send out their monthly statements. This was very important in the perpetration of Mr. Johnson's scheme because he was able to see that the transactions that he was making was going through. The credit card statement was probably very important to Mr. Johnson because of the monthly payments that he was making on his mother's Visa account. Mr. Johnson also used the mails when he paid bills by personal checks written from his Mac Visa account. Remember, this was the same account that he was transferring the fraudulent sales that he made at the video store. If Mr. Johnson is indicted for mail fraud, he could be fined not more than $1 million or imprisoned not more than 5 years or both. Since Mr. Johnson's scheme involved 3 financial institutions, he could be imprisoned up to 30 years, plus the fine. Violation number 5, wire fraud. Since Mr. Johnson used an access device to perpetrate his scheme, he violated the wire fraud law because the video store's point-of-sale terminal was connected to the telephone line. Since Mr. Johnson's scheme involved 3 financial institutions, he could be fined not more than $1 million or be imprisoned up to 30 years or both. Violation number 6, bank fraud. Mr. Johnson knowingly executed a scheme to defraud a financial institution when he transferred money from an authorized credit card to his Mac Visa account by using the video store's point-of-sale terminal. There were 3 different banks involved in every transaction that Mr. Johnson made. They are the credit card bank, Mr. Johnson's Mac Visa bank, and the video store's merchant bank. For this violation of federal law, Mr. Johnson could be fined not more than $1 million or be imprisoned not more than 30 years, or both. Following is the 3 bases that make a person guilty of a crime. Base number 1. A person is guilty if the person himself or herself committed the crime, that is, actually perpetrated the crime. Base number 2. A person is guilty as a co-conspirator if the person was a member of the conspiracy when the crime was committed, and if it was committed in the furtherance of or as a foreseeable consequence of the conspiracy. Base number 3. A person is guilty of a crime committed by someone else if the person aids and abets the commission of the crime. If any one or more of these 3 bases is shown by the evidence beyond a reasonable doubt, that is, that the person was the actual perpetrator of the crime, that the person was responsible as a co-conspirator, or that person was an aider or abettor, the person may be found guilty of the crime charged. The video store, doing its investigation, applied these 3 bases to Mr. Johnson when they drew up their indictment against him. It is not up to the video store to decide the guilt of Mr. Johnson. It's up to a court of law. Even though the video store's indictment of Mr. Johnson is factual, they didn't think that they were judge, jury, an executioner and didn't want to be held responsible for the wrongdoing by Mr. Johnson. Chapter 6. Layout of the video store. The following is probably the most important part of the story. I will show the layout of the video store and explain how Frank lured Mr. Johnson to the right spot behind the counter, which makes sure that the picture and sound would capture an electronic criminal. First of all, I'm going to describe the layout of the video store, which will show how Frank was able to record Mr. Johnson's confession. The video store is located on the north side of the street, near the corner. There's a lighted sign across the front of the video store, displaying the logo. This sign is visible a few blocks away, especially at night. Upon entering the video store, the sales counter is on your left, and the arcade games are to your right. Besides the two TVs in the front window, there are TVs located in every part of the store. The new release section is located almost in front of the sales counter and takes up about half of the store. The empty boxes are arranged in alphabetical order and displayed by category throughout the store. When a customer wants to rent a movie, they bring up the box or boxes to the counter where the clerk or manager or owner pulls the movie or movies from back of the counter that corresponds with the box or boxes that the customer has selected. Next, the volume numbers are entered on the customer's account. Payment is due on return. At this point of the story, the video store is only accepting cash and personal checks for payment. This policy was changed while the video store and banks were investigating Mr. Johnson's scheme. The video store also had a house charge for special customers. This type of account was used to classify customers that complained about the change in policy. The video store is equipped with a hold-up switch in case there was a robbery. All the employees were instructed what to do just in case they were involved in a dangerous situation. The video store also hooked up a camcorder that they used to rent for a specified fee, but since the battery pack wasn't holding the charge and the replacement battery packs were too expensive, therefore it wasn't worth it. You guessed it, the video store decided to connect this camcorder to the power pack and leave it on during business hours. Most of the surveillance cameras were black and white then, but this camcorder recorded in color. This camcorder was hooked up to one of the VCRs, which were connected to all the store's TVs. Everything was hooked up to a switch, which allowed the video store to push a button and show movies or the surveillance system on the TVs. This way the customer could see themselves on TV if whoever was in charge wanted to do this. If a movie showing on the screens, the camcorder was still recording what was going on in the video store. All the employees who worked in the video store knew how to work the VCRs and surveillance system, including Mr. Johnson. The day that Mr. Johnson confessed his embezzlement scheme to Frank, the tape was in one of the VCRs and recording everything going on. If Mr. Johnson didn't want what he said to be recorded, all he had to do was stop the VCR. The video store figures that Mr. Johnson was so overwhelmed over what he had done to realize what he was saying was being recorded. The following is a description of the store's conditions at the time leading up to Mr. Johnson's confession. First of all, Mr. Johnson was working by himself and couldn't leave until Frank relieved him. The video store was very busy and noisy when Frank arrived to relieve Mr. Johnson. The first thing that Frank did when he arrived was to make sure that the camcorder and VCR had blank tapes in them, and he set them on record. Now the stage was set. Mr. Johnson seemed excited, and he had the audacity to tell Frank that he got 46 G's from the video store. Then Mr. Johnson said $46,000 that he got by making a lot of large transactions, that he told Frank that one of the transactions was $8,000. And then he told Frank all the amounts of the other transactions would total $46,000. And he also told Frank that he would draw $10,000 in cash, and if he would have taken more, the bank would have had to fill out a currency transaction report. Even though the video store was busy and noisy, Mr. Johnson's confession came out very clear, because Frank lured Mr. Johnson back at the counter closest to the camcorder. After Mr. Johnson said all that he was going to say, he rushed out of the video store to go to the Mac machine to check his Mac Visa balance. This occurred on a Saturday afternoon around 2 p.m. in the middle of November of 1997. If that wasn't enough, the next day, which was Sunday, Mr. Johnson came in to relieve Frank. This time, Mr. Johnson was aware of the surveillance camera, which Frank had on record, and turned it off while showing Frank his 4-page Mac statement that he just got from the Mac machine up the street. The store was busy, and when Mr. Johnson wasn't looking, Frank turned on the surveillance system back to record, but Mr. Johnson didn't mention anything about his scheme the rest of his shift. Even though Mr. Johnson didn't say anything else, he left his 4-page Mac statement on the shelf in the video store, which Frank retained as part of the video store's evidence against Mr. Johnson. To sum everything up, Mr. Johnson wasn't aware of the surveillance camera being on when he made his confession to Frank on Saturday, but he was aware of the surveillance camera being on when he was showing Frank his 4-page Mac statement on Sunday. The next day, which was Monday, Frank notified the owner of what went down on the weekend. She congratulated Frank about what he had done. She knew that with the evidence that Frank got on Mr. Johnson's goose was going to be cooked. Mr. Johnson couldn't furnish the owner with the information that she wanted, and she fired him. The video store knows that Mr. Johnson doesn't know about the videotape confession he made to Frank, because he wouldn't have showed Frank the 4-page Mac statement the next day. Everything that I have said here did happen, and Mr. Johnson's confession proves this. Chapter 7. How Mr. Johnson developed his scheme. In this part of the story, I'm going to show the steps that Mr. Johnson used in the fruition of his scheme. Frank met Mr. Johnson in December of 1996 when he came in to rent movies. It didn't take long for them to become good friends. Frank was friendly with all the customers, not just Mr. Johnson. Since the video store was called a mom-and-pop store, they liked to hire people from the neighborhood. Since the video store was very busy at this time, Frank asked Mr. Johnson would he like to work as an assistant manager in the video store. Mr. Johnson said, "Frank, I have a job at the flower shop, which is a half a block away, but I could work part-time." This was the start of Mr. Johnson's training. Mr. Johnson was eager to learn everything that he could about the operation of the video store, and especially the operation of the point-of-sale terminal. Frank only showed Mr. Johnson what he needed to know to open and close the video store. The owner was very pleased the way Frank and Mr. Johnson were running the business. The following is probably when Mr. Johnson got the idea to try embezzle money from the video store. One day, Mr. Johnson punched in someone's credit card number. The video store wasn't sure if this credit card was his. The sale was for $100, and Mr. Johnson put the slip in the cash drawer and took out $100 in cash. When Frank saw the slip in the drawer, he told Mr. Johnson, "You can't do that." Mr. Johnson asked Frank why. Frank told him that the sale you made was against the store and merchant bank policy. Frank showed Mr. Johnson how to avoid the sale and settle the point of sale terminal to zero. Frank told him that he had to put the $100 cash back in the drawer. Mr. Johnson put the money back and told Frank that he was sorry and he didn't want to get in trouble. Frank thought that this was an honest mistake. I would like to point something out about this transaction that I didn't like. I think Mr. Johnson was testing the system to see if what he did would be detected. Frank did notice that the slips had different account numbers. When Frank asked Mr. Johnson about this, he said he grabbed the wrong card and that all his cards are good. This incident happened about 2 months after Mr. Johnson was hired. This was an isolated incident to the video store then, but developed in something more serious later on. This was probably the infancy of Mr. Johnson's scheme. Everything seemed to be going good for a while. Then all of a sudden, customers start telling Frank that they were seeing Mr. Johnson in the video store after hours. Remember, Mr. Johnson had keys and all the codes and could come and go at will. When Frank asked Mr. Johnson about this, he said that he would sometimes double back to make sure that everything was done the way the owner wanted it done when she opened the store the next day. Frank didn't like his explanation and became suspicious of Mr. Johnson. Since Mr. Johnson and Frank were still good friends, Frank was hoping that his gut was wrong. Things were quiet for a while. Then one day, the owner noticed that the settlement showed there were 6 transactions, but she only had 4 slips. This happened on Mr. Johnson's shift. The owner told Frank to ask Mr. Johnson what happened. Frank asked Mr. Johnson about the discrepancy between the number of transactions and the number of slips. As usual, Mr. Johnson seemed to have an answer ready. This is what the man said. A customer bought 3 used movies for $25, and he punched in $250 by mistake. To correct this error, he voided the $250 sale and did the $25 sale again. Frank asked Mr. Johnson where are the voided slips. He said he didn't want anyone to know that he made a stupid mistake, so he tore up the slips. Frank accepted this explanation and told Mr. Johnson that the owner checks the settlement slips every day. Now that Mr. Johnson knew we were checking him closely, he watched his P's and Q's, and he was really doing a good job. Frank was proud of him, but behind the scenes, Mr. Johnson was preparing to strike again. Mr. Johnson made sure that the slips matched the transactions when there were real sales. Frank and the video store didn't have a clue. This author thinks that Mr. Johnson did the large sales after hours and settled everything to zero and destroyed all the slips. This way, Frank and the owner only saw what business that the video store actually did. That's why the deception that Mr. Johnson used was hard to detect. By the time the large sales showed up, Mr. Johnson had all the money that he intended to get and closed his Mac Visa account. After he withdrew the embezzled money, this way the banks couldn't transfer the money back to the video store. I decided now would be a good time of part of the story to give Mr. Johnson a mock trial. Based on the evidence that I have presented here, this would be a good time since Mr. Johnson just closed his Mac Visa account, which means that he got all the money that he intended to get. Assuming that Mr. Johnson was held for trial, the following is what this author feels would have went down. The following verdict was rendered after the witnesses had been cross-examined, evidence was produced by the video store, and Mr. Johnson's testimony was heard. Remember, the following verdict is what I believe would happen if Mr. Johnson was tried. The jury deliberated for about an hour and returned to the courtroom to render its verdict. The clerk tells the members of the jury that he understands that they have reached a verdict. And first of all, he will ask the foreperson as to the results of the verdict form. Then the clerk tells the other 11 persons that they will be asked whether they agree as a group, and you will be asked whether you agree with the verdict as announced by the foreperson. The clerk then tells these 11 jurors, if you agree with the verdict, you will say yes, and if you don't agree with the verdict, you will say no. Now listen carefully. If you agree when you are asked collectively, you say yes, and if you don't agree, please let us know. The clerk asks the foreperson to please rise, and then he asks the members of the jury, have they reached a verdict? The foreperson says yes. The clerk now asks the foreperson, how do you find the defendant, Mr. Johnson, as to count 1, wire fraud? The foreperson says guilty, and to count number 2, bank fraud. The foreperson says guilty, and to count number 3, credit card fraud. The foreperson says guilty, and to count number 4, conspiracy. The foreperson says guilty, and to count number 5, money laundering. The foreperson says guilty. The clerk tells everyone to be seated and tells the members of the jury to listen to the verdict as the court has recorded it in the case of the United States versus Mr. Johnson. You find the defendant, Mr. Johnson, guilty in the manner and form as he stands indicted as to count number 1, and so say you all. The jury says yes. The clerk asked him, does anyone find him not guilty as to count number 1? There was no response from the jury. Then the clerk asked the jury as to count 2, your verdict is guilty, and so say you all. The jury says yes. Does anyone find him not guilty as to count number 2? There was no response from the jury. Then the clerk asked the jury as to count number 3, your verdict is guilty, and so say you all. The jury says yes. Does anyone find him not guilty as to count number 3? There was no response from the jury. Then the clerk asked the jury as to count number 4. Your verdict is guilty, so say you all. The jury says yes. Does anyone find him not guilty as to count number 4? There was no response from the jury. Then the clerk asked the jury as to count number 5. Your verdict is guilty, and so say you all. The jury says yes. Does anyone find him not guilty as to count number 5? There was no response from the jury. Remember the expression, silence is golden. I guess now you know where that quote originated from. Now the clerk tells Mr. Johnson to stand up. The judge reads the verdict and the sentence aloud in the courtroom. The judge tells Mr. Johnson, you have been found guilty on all 5 counts against you, and you are sentenced to serve 60 months in prison, which will give you plenty of time to reflect on what you did to a small business who trusted you and all the friendships that you betrayed by your criminal actions. When you are released from prison, you will serve 3 years of supervised release, and have to pay full restitution in the amount of $46,000. Then the judge asked Mr. Johnson, does he understand what he had done? Mr. Johnson says, I understand, Your Honor. I hope you enjoyed this mock trial. I'm pretty sure that Mr. Johnson would probably plead guilty to avoid a jury trial. Chapter 8. Explanation of Mr. Johnson's confession. Since you don't have Mr. Johnson's confession to view, I decided to explain it in detail. When Frank lured Mr. Johnson to the best spot to get the best recording, he asked him, did you really get $46,000 from the video store's bank? Mr. Johnson said, I got 46 G's. Then, in an emphatic manner, he said $46,000, speaking every number slowly. This was the amount that Mr. Johnson intended to get, but it may not be the amount that he actually embezzled, but it is the amount that he mentioned in the videotape confession. The video store believes that at least two of the large transactions at the end of Mr. Johnson's scheme might not have cleared. In the next part of the confession, Mr. Johnson tells Frank that he made one transaction in the amount of $8,000 and went on to tell Frank all the amounts that he forced through, which totaled $46,000. The $8,000 transaction that Mr. Johnson embezzled was the largest one. During the taping of Mr. Johnson's confession, he was so excited of what he had done that he was talking fast and moving around because he was in a hurry to go to the Mac machine. Before Mr. Johnson left, Frank asked him, why didn't you take more money? Then what he said next didn't make sense to this author. Mr. Johnson went on to tell Frank that he wasn't sure that what was going to happen if he got caught, and if he did, he would only have to pay 10% of whatever amount he got. I think that he is confusing this 10% with the amount of bail that you pay if you want to be released until you appear before your arraignment. Did Mr. Johnson think that paying 10% of the money was going to justify his crime? No matter what, Mr. Johnson was so excited, he thought that he was going to be able to keep 90% of the money that he embezzled. I think that Mr. Johnson was suffering from visions of grandeur. Enough of this poppycock. Let's get back to the rest of Mr. Johnson's confession to Frank. In the next part of the confession, Frank asked Mr. Johnson how he got the money from his account. Mr. Johnson said that he went to his bank and withdrew $10,000 cash, no questions asked. And Mr. Johnson said that he didn't take more than $10,000 because a transaction report would have to be filled out. Mr. Johnson structured his transactions so that he wouldn't break the $10,000 rule law. Before I get back to the rest of Mr. Johnson's confession, I'm going to explain the $10,000 rule. Congress passed this law in 1971 to make sure that the banks would have to file a report on transactions over $10,000. If the banks did not file this transaction report, the bank itself and the bank employee who engaged in the transaction could be prosecuted for violating the law. More recently, Congress passed a law that says if an individual designs or structures a transaction in such a way as to prevent the bank from filling out a currency transaction report, then that individual is violating the law. This is what Mr. Johnson did by withdrawing not more than $10,000. I don't know why Mr. Johnson didn't just withdraw $5,000 at a time. I guess he didn't want to draw suspicion at the bank, and he was probably afraid that if he didn't get the money as fast as he could, something might go wrong with his scheme. In other words, he withdrew the money as soon as funds became available, as fast as he could. Now back to the rest of Mr. Johnson's confession. Frank asked Mr. Johnson, "Weren't you afraid to walk out of the bank carrying $10,000 in cash?" Mr. Johnson made a few hand motions and then said that he didn't come out of the bank waving the money in the air, saying, "Look what I got." At this point of the confession, Mr. Johnson is moving away from the camera. Then Frank asked Mr. Johnson what he did with all the money. Then he told Frank that he bought a nice car for $2,500, and he gave his mother some money to hold for him in case he needed it later. He also paid for a vacation for him and his fiancée, and also put money into 2 banks near his mother's home. Then Mr. Johnson went to the back of the video store and punched out. And you guessed it, went to the Mac machine to check his available balance. That is the gist of Mr. Johnson's confession, as I interpreted it when I viewed it several times. Remember that Mr. Johnson's confession was only about 3 minutes in length, and Mr. Johnson didn't know that what he was saying was being recorded, or he wouldn't have said what he did. The actual videotape of Mr. Johnson's confession is very clear. Isn't this ironic that Mr. Johnson rents videotapes, but he won't rent a videotape of his confession? Chapter 9. Final Thoughts. Since I am writing this story at the present time, I will let you know what happened from then till now. First of all, the video store and Frank were absolved of any wrongdoing, and the video store continued to do good for 5 years after this incident. The video store moved to a smaller location in the same neighborhood. This downsizing helped this mom-and-pop store still make a profit. Frank was able to run the store by himself. He felt that he was the owner, not just a manager. The owner gave Frank complete control of everything. The business was slowing down because of cable and the internet. Frank used his compulsive behavior to come up with ideas to increase business. Frank decided to sell DVD players and give the customer 10 free rentals. This wasn't working, so Frank decided to change the advertisement from buying a DVD player for $25 and get 10 free rentals to buying 10 rentals for $25 and get a DVD player for free. This really did the trick. Business was booming again. Since DVDs were cheap, Frank bought a lot of copies of new releases. This brought all those customers who bought the DVD players into the store to use up the rentals. Since this store was in the neighborhood and the big store was closer to center of town, it was easier for the customers to get there. Frank was doing a good job competing with the big chain video stores. You know who they are. Frank kept reinventing this small store. Frank's big thing was to decorate the video store at Christmas, and he even put a live tree outside. Every year he had a different theme. One year he even had a lighted fireplace in the window. He achieved this by putting brick paper around the TV and showing a fireplace video on it. Frank has videotapes of every Christmas at this small store. In the winter, the video stores were busier than other times of the year, especially when it snowed. Since the large video chains had a big overhead, they were closing stores, but Frank was still doing good. But it finally happened. After 4 years at this location, this small store was going down, and Frank had to close it because of all the cable ads which said, "No more trips to the video store. You can stay home and pay to view whatever you want without leaving the comfort of your home." Frank didn't have to make any more trips to the video store either. Frank's dream job finally came to an end. Frank got jobs right away. He worked at the gas station, and he also worked at the ice cream store, plus all the odd jobs he had. Even though Frank got into trouble over 20 years ago, and even the embezzlement that Mr. Johnson did at the video store didn't stop us from living our lives together. Mr. Johnson accepted responsibility for the wrongdoing that he did at the video store in 1997 and took a plea bargain and was sentenced to 3 years probation in order to pay full restitution of $46,000. The videotape confession that Frank got did prove that Frank and the video store had nothing to do with Mr. Johnson's scheme. This confession was legally obtained because if Mr. Johnson didn't want to be recorded, all he had to do was turn off the VCR. Mr. Johnson proved this the next day when he showed Frank the 4-page Mac statement. He turned off the VCR. Frank also told me what he did next. Frank hooked up another VCR in the drop ceiling and wired it to the camera. This way, if one of the employees would turn off the VCR under the counter, Frank would still have a copy of what went on when he was off. The employees didn't realize that by having the store under surveillance, it was protecting them if there was a robbery. The owner of the video store liked the idea of having that second VCR hidden in the drop ceiling. Mr. Johnson's scheme caused the video store to stop taking Mac and credit cards for payment. The video store kept this policy in effect even after the video store was absolved of wrongdoing. Everybody knew about Frank's crime, but nobody knew about Mr. Johnson's embezzlement scheme against the video store. If Mr. Johnson would have come up with his scheme now, all he had to do was sit in front of a computer and transfer money from victims' accounts to his Mac Visa account without leaving the comfort of his home. Then I would have called him a cyber criminal instead of an electronic criminal. I was behind the scenes when all this criminal activity was going on. Frank worked on this investigation of Mr. Johnson while he was at the prison camp. He sent me these investigative reports as fast as he typed them. Frank told me to make copies and give these reports to the owner so that she can keep the merchant bank from closing the video store down. As fast as Frank sent me these reports, I would call the owner and she would pick them up at the house. She told me that she really appreciated my help. She used to bring me free movies to look at. She would bring the new releases as soon as they came out and pick up the ones from the previous week. This went on until Frank came home from the prison camp. I believe that if Frank wouldn't have exposed Mr. Johnson's scheme and got that confession on him, that the bank would have closed the video store down and it would have had a sheriff's sale to pay for what was embezzled by Mr. Johnson. I don't think if the video store would have hired an outside agency to investigate Mr. Johnson's scheme, they could have done a better job than Frank did. If I ever met Mr. Johnson today, I would like to tell him face to face, you messed with the wrong company, and instead of using Frank in the video store to get blamed for what you did, you got caught because of the investigation that they did on you. I didn't write the story right after it happened because I felt that it would be bad publicity for the video store, and it might have given future Mr. Johnson's ideas to try the same scheme that Mr. Johnson did. I didn't mention the names of the witnesses when writing the story because I really didn't know who did what in reference to Mr. Johnson's scheme. This information was furnished to the merchant bank to aid them in their part of the investigation. Now at the present time, Frank and I are retired and stay home enjoying each other's company, looking at movies and all those Christmas videos that Frank recorded every Christmas at the video store. I would like to close this story by saying, all's well that ends well.
It's not what they do from is a shame. You look so good. It's like customer service is good. Keep it up there. The greediness and needing the money cause them to don't trouble with that. They don't want everything. Nice. It's good. I mean, they could be busy.
Make 200 last night, 196. I didn't even check. 196. Grab that. Did you see Jurassic Park Lost World? Grab that one right there. Right under the next line line. So anyway, gonna have to fill a form and everything for that kind of money. But yet they're putting that in your account. You take money out of it. I take it all out. All out. Right there first. You can take it. Don't give it. And doesn't even ask how you got it. No. See, loans won't take over 10,000. If you take 10,100, then they have to write a credit report to the credit. If you take anything under 10,000, they don't count. The dollar is 9,999. Don't matter. Walking around with that kind of money. Yeah, that's scary. Yeah, scared. But nobody said it. I wasn't letting on it. Not like I went around like, you know. But I separated and paid it hard. Everything you have. It looks like it's worth more. Yeah. I mean, that was a deal. I don't. You don't know nothing, right? I don't know, because I don't want to go right now. Let me bring that. All right, I'm out. I think I got the rest. I don't think it's going to be much now. He comes a little early, hopefully. I only have an hour. There's big stuff in here. Yeah, there's a lot of return. Everything's already been put back. There's not much return. You're not, yeah. Consider we're not coming off that big day like last year. Yeah, you got Solomon. Or three. The other ones now, we just made the same money. 485. They're coming out here. Oh, it's Brendan Lee.
No, it's not.
Oh, no, wait. Oh, no, that's right. This is it.
Tomorrow,
Right,
2 to
that's
10.
right.
With you, and then I'm off all the way until Thursday. Now I come in at 4:30.
That's right, good. Good, okay. I like it. I got that early. I know you'll be here. At least I went out to play. We're going to probably have a lot of dinner and stuff early. Yeah. Tomorrow I got all right. All the members today got to come back tomorrow. while you can get them while they last.